Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. I'll be co-hosting this episode with my friend Victoria Loorz, author of the book Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. Together, we'll be in conversation with Nina Simons, co-founder of Bioneers, an organization that amplifies the voices of innovators who are coming up with practical and visionary solutions for the world's most pressing environmental and social challenges. We'll be talking in great part about her book titled Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. Among other things, this book makes a case for more cooperation, collaboration, and even community between all those who are working for the good of this planet that we share.
I believe there are common values that many of our movements share around the world, and that were we able to reach across those false separations and identify the common values, which is very much what Bioneers tries to do, is to create a field where pluralism is celebrated, but there is a basis of common value that says the earth is sacred, no matter how you come to it.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Well, greetings to all our listeners all over the world. In today's episode, I have a friend who will be co-hosting with me, Victoria Loorz, founder of the Center for Wild Spirituality, also known as the Seminary of the Wild. And she's also the author of the book Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you, Forrest. I'm so excited to be here with you and with Nina, and calling in from Ireland today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our guest today is Nina Simons, author of the book Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. Welcome to you, Nina.
Thank you, Forrest. And hello, Victoria. Glad to be here with both of you. I'm calling in from northern New Mexico, the traditional indigenous lands of the Tiwa, Tewa, and Keres-speaking peoples, or the northern Pueblos.
Nina, we'll be talking about your book today, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred. But I wonder if first we might hear a bit about the organization that you co-founded called Bioneers, since so much of your book draws on learnings from that context. I mean, what is Bioneers and what needs does the organization seek to meet in the world, maybe particularly in the realm of earth care?
Bioneers is an organization that I started with my co-founder and partner, Kenny Ausubel, in 1990. And we originally started it partly in response to the warnings that were coming out about climate change. And we knew at that time that not only was climate change a threat, but so was toxic pollution, and so was the use of water. And, you know, there were a lot of things about our civilization that were clearly unsustainable and heading us in a wrong direction. And at the same time, what we saw was that the mainstream media tends to cover the bad news, but really never covers the emergent innovations of people who are really inventing ways to live in right relationship with ourselves, each other, and the earth. And so we really started Bioneers as a way of lifting up innovative leaders from all walks of life who had both practical and visionary solutions for changing how we live on earth and with each other. And we found very quickly that people responded immensely to what we were doing. We also found that in relation to alerting people about climate change, we were so heavily outspent. We were a tiny nonprofit, struggling along, of course. And meanwhile, we were going to education conferences and seeing that the oil and gas companies were spending fortunes to distribute their curriculum, which really led to the widespread prevalence of climate deniers in the world today. But in the meantime, over the last 32 years, we have been kind of like an environmental and social star search. And what we found is that people's experience of Bioneers, whether at a conference or online, because we really become a media company year round, introduces them to the vision of the world that's possible. And that greatly ignites people's inspiration and engagement and desire to actually act on behalf of the future that we really want and on behalf of Earth Care. You know, a great number of Bioneers are actually people who have innovated based on nature's models. And so it's really shifting our relationship to the natural world so that we become the students and nature becomes the teacher. And it's very sweet to be here with Victoria, who I first met because her son was featured at a Bioneers conference. Victoria, you want to say something about that?
Yes, many years ago, right? Bioneers has been really a central part of our own journeys. My son, I say now, my son was sort of like Greta 15, 20 years ago. We went to Bioneers every year. And there was always something, some particular speaker every year. I always would say it, like, who's going to be the one this year that's going to? I remember Janine Benyus was one year, and the father of green chemistry another year. And every year their work would be kind of like, okay, I'm going to shift our work to, it sort of like bends toward the work that I would learn at Bioneers. It was really, for many years, an important central part of my own work and my own journey.
I realized the thing I wanted to add about Bioneers is that it afforded me an opportunity to be exposed to so many innovative leaders over the course of these 32 years. And because I embarked on an inquiry about leadership and what is leadership now and what is the leadership that's called for from the earth, I had an opportunity to study literally thousands of leaders through programming and hosting Bioneers, which was an amazing gift in my life and really helped lead to the evolution of my work and my writing.
Yes, it absolutely shows through in your book. I think that's one of the things that's so valuable about it. It's not just sort of making conclusions about leadership or your own leadership, but it's in relationship and conversation with hundreds, maybe even thousands of phenomenal leaders, not just leaders. So beautiful. After many years of being in the center with the youth climate movement, both my son and I hit a place of burnout. And it was through that burnout that we sort of deepened in and recognized that the spiritual connection with the land herself was missing, both in my work within the church, as well as our work within the movement. We were fighting so hard and focused on the campaigns and whatnot that we had disconnected with an intimacy with the rest of the natural world, which is a work of spiritual reconnection. And that is really the work that both Forrest and I are focused on now, this what we call the ecotone edge, of spirituality, where all of those most diverse parts of life exist. And we found that that's the underlying grounding of any transformational action. And that came through in your book. And I don't know that you were precisely meaning to, but it's these ideas of spiritual versus emotional versus physical versus scientific are all not real constructs. And so that spiritual grounding really comes through, especially these women-led movements that you talk about. And so I just wanted to invite you to address that. Do you think that's true? And how do you feel like spirituality can be more deeply ingrained into ecological activism? And it's not just get more faith communities involved in the movement, but really to honor that inherently diverse expressions of spirituality as that grounding. Just wanted to hear you address that more directly.
It's a beautiful question. Thank you. It's part of the reason that I named the book Nature, Culture, and the Sacred is because my relationship to spirituality is a kind of secular spirituality that draws from many different sources, and particularly from my own direct experience with the natural world, and also from studying indigenous cultures. And I think what you just said in terms of the false separations between science and the sacred and human experience and what moves us is those false separations have to be dissolved. And it's funny, I just saw an 11-minute film on YouTube that's called The Mycelium is Listening. And it's this exquisite combination of beautiful slow motion footage of all these mushroom, fungi, mycelium forms. And then Paul Stamets's voice explaining that science has now proven that the mycelium are responsive to sound, and that they're not only responsive to sound, but particularly responsive to very low frequency sound, which means that if you think about our ancestors and first peoples doing rituals to call the rain, and the mycelium actually hearing the drum beats, right, and responding, it's an active conversation. And, that is a combination of the sacred, the spiritual, the cultural, and all things in between. And for me, that element of integrating a secular, sacred spirituality in whatever form it takes is essential to transforming our culture, which is what I believe has to happen in order for us to live on a livable planet.
Yeah, it's no matter what religious tradition you're connected with, there is that, our common ground is the common ground. And connecting our spirituality with the rest of the natural world is just agenda and reality and yearning and longing. Like so many people are longing for this and already experience it. We just need to give permission almost.
Well, and what I've been noticing recently is how what we consider sacred is what we most love and what we feel most related to. Anyone who's a parent, right, knows your kids are sacred to you. And the more that I study Native peoples and their history and their cultures, the more that I understand that from the time of their birth, they actually are related to other elements of the natural world. And they are literally assigned as relatives. And so that's what we hold sacred. And how do we, as people who didn't have the benefit of that cultural upbringing, rekindle that for and with each other?
I interviewed a couple of folks who wrote a book called What Your Food Ate. Bickle and Montgomery are their names. And they really are trying to interpret the science of ecology for most folks, especially in the realm of how do we think about food and the way that food's produced and how it affects us, what we eat, all of that. But throughout the whole interview, and I noted this actually in the conversation to them later on, they use this relationship language, right? They kept talking about the community of the soil, right? And how the soil was connected to the community of the flora and fauna, and ultimately how we all were part of that community and belonged in this collective that included fungus in the soil, and bacteria. And I just thought it was so interesting that even these folks who were really scientists were using that language, which really provokes wonder. It's not just facts. It's not just cut and dried ideas. But I think that when you study these things, when you really begin to understand what's going on, it just evokes wonder no matter who you are.
Yes.
So I get a lot of requests to review books. We don't review all the books that we are asked to review on the podcast. But when we do, it kind of puts the onus on me to read quickly. I have to read and find the main points really and the most salient points that we could then talk about in the podcast. And that was initially my approach to this book, but it was not to be. I realized pretty early on that this was not going to be a quick read. And I'll just read you my trouble spot. It happened on page 13. I'll read your words here. It says, I suggest that you trust that exactly who you are is what is needed at this moment in the world. Know that you are already enough in every way to meet this assignment. And here's the best part. I suggest you do this not because it's right, though it is, not because it's needed, though it surely is, but because it's the most joyful, purposeful, and fulfilling way to live your life. I had to put the book down, and I thought, oh no, this book is going to take a lot longer for me to read, simply because it was challenging me on fundamental levels. I mean, that passage, it honestly moved me to tears because it touched that place in me that often feels that I'm not enough for the task, that I often feel overwhelmed by the enormity of what we're facing in terms of climate change and climate injustice. So I'll warn the readers who must get this book and read it, but they should read slowly and take the time, because not only are your ideas quite profound and challenging, but you've also got a lot of thought-provoking questions and prompts that you've built in between each section, each chapter. And that really, really does add to a reader's experience of the book in profound ways. I'm wondering if you could comment on how you shaped the book and what are your hopes for the ways that readers will engage the book?
Well, Forrest, I love that you read that quote, because part of where the book evolved out of was, for the last 15 to 20 years, I have been convening groups of very diverse women leaders, women who were diverse in every way, by age, by orientation, by class, by race. And what I found was that there seems to be an almost universal perception that these women carried, that we were not enough. And we developed all these exercises to literally try to exorcise those voices from within us, because I realized that what had kept me from speaking out sooner in my life and from writing more sooner and from being more of a leader was these voices that said, you're not educated enough, you're not linear enough, you're not smart enough, you're not whatever, fill in the blank enough. And I have come to believe that because we're all products of a deficit-focused culture, we all carry that within us. And for women especially, there are lots of studies that have been done about how boys are taught to crow when they do something good and to cheer their own achievements. But girls are not. Girls are supposed to be quiet and behind the scenes, and you're not supposed to brag and feel good about yourself. And so thank you for reading that piece. The book evolved out of, I told you about Bioneers and our annual conferences. Well, one of my opportunities was to write a piece for every conference. And each year I would go through this deep soul searching to try to understand what I could offer that could be of use value to the most people. And it was always a very humble process, because I inevitably felt less qualified than all of the speakers we were lifting up. But it was a very personal process. So what I realized was that I had all these essays that I had written, and I thought that they were good. And once we organized them, they came into sort of three categories, which the book is in, which the first is really about my discoveries about gender, and both how my understanding of gender, I came to understand, both limited me and also strengthened me. The second is from a more analytical, global perspective. What is the war on women? How can we understand it better? Because it is global. And what is the evidence? What are both the challenges and the promise of more women in leadership? And the third is really about racial justice and beloved community, and my work toward understanding how I can become a better ally, how I can convene diverse people in ways that create a field that's conducive to creating connection across difference. Because I think, just as Victoria mentioned earlier, part of our challenge as a species right now is to learn to perceive difference as an asset and a virtue, not a polarizing thing. And then what happened between really the first and the second edition of the book was that I realized that all the learning I had done from all those women's leadership deep immersion retreats could be integrated into this book. I learned from the first edition that there were women's circles and professors using the book both in classrooms and to advance and accelerate their own learning. And so my hope for the book is that whether people use it individually, men and women, as a way of understanding more about this gender polarized place we seem to find ourselves in, and the opportunity to rebalance, or women's circles or in classrooms, I'm hoping that the prompts make it easier for anyone to really reflect and integrate this learning in a deeper way. So I'm 65 now, and it feels like a really good time to be offering the world whatever I've learned. And it's not that I'm going to stop learning. I'm certainly keeping on going, but it's my prayer and my offering, this book.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for that. Yeah.
It's part of being an elder. It's very, very clear. I really appreciate how you, throughout the book, are able to focus on empowering women, empowering people of color, Indigenous people, without really needing to denigrate men, or you're able to hold both because you hold that patriarchy, just like white supremacy, is a system and it hurts all of us. And I want to quote a quote from your book, too, that are your words. The words are just so beautiful. I want to embroider these on a pillow. We will find the greatest creative opportunities for collaboration and learning in the places where the edges meet, to constellate together a web of co-creativity and mutuality on behalf of Mother Earth and the entire web of life. It's just so beautiful. Wanted to ask you if you could talk a little more about where you've experienced this learning on the edges, and which edges seem to be the most alive for you right now, and maybe for our culture.
Wow. Well, thank you for that reflection. It's always important to me to remember that feminism is never inherently about denigrating men or the masculine. For me, the fullest expression of each of our humanity, regardless of what gendered body we may happen to be in, is an integration of the masculine and the feminine, or the yin and the yang. Many of the world's ancient spiritual traditions refer to this as the model of holism. And so edges, I first really learned about edges from Janine Benyus, who you mentioned earlier, who is the godmother of biomimicry. And she spoke about how in nature, the places of greatest innovation are the places where two or more ecosystems meet. And so she said where a river meets the edge of the forest, or where the ocean conjoins with the river and the forest, that's where the greatest number of new species evolve and newness evolves. And so because we as humans are a subset of nature, we're not apart from nature, we are nature, and we're an expression of her, if you'll pardon my pronoun. And so because of that, the greatest expression of our human creativity is where all the edges meet. And I think one of the things that I write about in the book is that my dearest hope for us to get through this confluence of catastrophes that we're facing right now is that right now our social movements are tremendously divided and splintered. And even within the women's and feminist movements, they're divided and splintered by generation, by class, by race. And really, I believe there are common values that many of our movements share around the world. And that were we able to reach across those false separations and identify the common values, which is very much what Bioneers tries to do, is to create a field where pluralism is celebrated, but there is a basis of common value that says the earth is sacred, no matter how you come to it. And whether you're a food sovereignty activist or an activist on behalf of reinventing our economies or our education or our health system, it's all about the systems needing reinvention and being sacred. And so within that context, that's my greatest hope for the edges to meet, is for all of our social movements, including, of course, our governance and our corporations, who right now are causing the greatest harms, to find common cause in the interest of saving the quality of humanity's life on Earth, because the Earth herself doesn't need saving. She's going to survive. It may take her billions of years to recover from us, but she'll be just fine over the long haul. It's we and the many, many species that we are responsible for eliminating and dying off at this time that we need to fight for. And I'm not even sure we need to fight. I want to say we need to take a stand for, on behalf of. We need to stand with and be the voices for. Because I think framing it as a fight is an old paradigm, and it's probably what helped you, Victoria, burn out from your past life incarnation as a climate activist.
It almost keeps the old system in place, as Bioneers talks about.
Yes. Well, any kind of polarization that creates that binary separation can't, by its nature, can't win. It's a win-lose paradigm.
One of the themes really that I picked up on throughout the book was the question of balance, or rather imbalance, of the masculine and the feminine in the world. Help us understand, if you would, how are you using those terms masculine and feminine?
Such a good question, Forrest, because everyone relates to them differently. And truth be told, one of my favorite clarifiers comes from an incredible primatologist, a Dutch primatologist named Frans de Waal. And you can look him up on YouTube. He's got a great talk he gave at Bioneers. But he says that there's a big difference between sex and gender, because his recent book was studying gender in our closest relatives biologically, the primates, who he has studied all his life. And he says, sex is pretty cut and dried. Sex, it's about the genitalia you have. And obviously, we are living through a time where some people feel that they are born into the wrong bodies. And so there is some flexibility there. But basically, there's male and female in the sex realm. In the gender realm, there is a great deal more flexibility. And he says in the primates that, for example, the phrase alpha male has been completely misconstrued in our culture to mean like Rambo and all the aggressive male archetypes that we see coming out of Hollywood. But that in the primate world, an alpha male is the one that everyone looks to for guidance. He's the one who actually breaks up fights, and he teaches the young males how to break up fights. And he also stands with the young males to protect them if an elder is threatening them. And so that's what an alpha male does in the primate world. And in the primate world, if a mother of an infant dies, the males often will take over the parenting and will raise the baby from birth. And the females also have much more varied gender roles in the primate world. And there are some females who show up in very masculinized ways. So when I use the phrases of masculine and feminine, I often want to put air quotes around them, because really, the true feminine is so much more than our cultures have led us to believe. It's not just this frilly, pink, emotive, relational, the true feminine actually includes a quality of fierceness and of protectiveness and of rage and of activism. That's part of the true feminine. And the masculine also has a deeply nurturing, protective, caring side. So for me, it sometimes helps to refer to them more as like the yin and the yang, because the true feminine is receptive, but she also has all these other qualities. And the true masculine is active. And again, as human beings, I believe that no matter what our temporary gender assignment, we all have all of those qualities within us. And for me, in my leadership, I want to be able to draw from anywhere in that spectrum of quote feminine to quote masculine. And I hope that we all help to reclaim healthy definitions of what those terms really mean, because they're too self-limiting otherwise. And really, we need men to learn relational intelligence, which is what has typically been referred to as chick flicks in the Hollywood world, which is just awful. When my husband uses that phrase, I often want to smack him and say, come on, you need this too. And we all need experiences that bring us, that remind us of the value of our emotional lives, because they are not purely feminine. They are a gift from nature. And frankly, if I could wave a magic wand, I would give everyone on earth a time out to grieve for all that we've lost in the last few years, and also a chance to reclaim a healthy relationship to our anger, because it has a healthy place in our cultures, and we need it now, actually, to be able to stand strong and fierce and committedly on behalf of what we love and find most sacred.
So, as a male reader, I read your book as a challenge for male leaders to seek a rebalance as well, a challenge to give greater expression to our feminine selves, and not just leaders. I think this is a challenge to all men. I'm wondering, what does that look like? Or rather, how might men deconstruct those hyper-masculine models of leadership that we've been taught? And how do we discover a more balanced way of being?
Well, it's a great question. And I love that you felt drawn into the book, Forrest, because really, I mean, if I were to reach for one of my highest hopes, it would be that men read this book and are moved by it. Although I do know that that may be a tall order, but we'll see. I think that as we know, the question of men and women has been falsely separated in too many ways, because every man was born from a mother, and many men have daughters and sisters and aunties and women in their lives that they are deeply connected to. So the truth is, we need a women's movement that has a lot more men involved and engaged in it. And I always love when men feel courageous enough to go on a women's march and bring signs and really advocate for women. In this country, we're facing a time where women's sovereign right over our own bodies is under threat. And we need a lot of men to stand up with us on behalf of our personal freedoms. But in answer to your question, I think that that process of, I call it compost and cauldron, there is a process that I've been through to cultivate my own leadership. And it has to do with shedding the societal norms that I have picked up without ever choosing to consciously, and putting them in the compost and making rituals about that and holding myself accountable to a deep level of introspection to notice when I'm interrupting somebody who might be a woman, or discounting a woman's perspective, or not advocating on behalf of a woman. But the other side is, I think that there is a collective thing that has to happen also, because what I found with women is that there is tremendous value in getting together in caucus form, just like there is for people of color to get together without white people present, to talk about what the impacts and influences and realities of living, being treated as less than in a world that purports to be equal. And I think there is a lot of room for men's circles and men's groups, or for men just to develop close male relationships and talk about this stuff. And then in the business world, there are all kinds of other translations of it. But, to translate to a societal level, what I would say is that in the center part of the book, there are amazing statistics about what happens when more women get into leadership and when more women are at the peacemaking tables. And honestly, it does what Wendell Berry describes as having cascading benefits. He says there are certain solutions to a problem that you look for, and he calls it solving for pattern. And he says when you find the right solution, it has cascading benefits that not only solves the initial problem you were looking to solve, which in this case might be gender equity, but it also has positive impacts on climate, on environment, on equity in economic equity, on food systems, and on education. Really, every aspect of society benefits from more women in leadership and more women being more highly educated and having more reproductive rights. And, it's one of the things that Paul Hawken's work in Drawdown identifies as one of the top solutions for climate change, is advancing the rights and education and leadership of women. And so I think we need to frame this in ways that help everyone understand that this is about all of us. It's not just about women. It's about improving life for all humanity and for all of our non-human cousins and kin and relatives.
Yeah, I want to maybe take that even a step further, your statement that having more women in leadership is part of the solution to our global and systemic problems. I would add, and I think you really say this in the book, that it's also about more men in leadership who are more activated in those feminine parts of themselves, right? If more men were valuing the feminine in themselves, they would be better leaders. They would be making better decisions. Do you agree?
Oh, I totally agree. And in fact, there's a wonderful resource that listeners may want to check out called the Athena Doctrine. And it's about a global meta-study that was done with many thousands of people all over the world, 13 nations. And what they found was that fully 66% of those people surveyed agreed that the world would be a healthier and better place if more men led more like women. So, it's a brilliant piece of work and quite fascinating. And so, yes, it is very much about how do we restore that balance? There is a native myth that says that the bird of humanity has been flying on only one wing for far too long. And this is the time for the wing of the feminine to rise up so that the bird can stop flying in circles and stop its ecocidal spiral and fly in another direction.
So much of your book does talk about these sort of systemic or global community ways of thinking about the masculine and feminine. I will say that I found myself continually circling back, though, to the personal, to that balance in men of the masculine and the feminine. And it wasn't until yesterday that I realized why. And I realized that much of my life has been that struggle. In particular, I adopted my daughter the day she was born, and as a single man was parenting her by myself. And so I had to very quickly do what you were calling composting, setting aside some of those ways that were not going to be effective on their own. And then even seeing what grew from the compost in terms of, well, then what does good parenting that's balanced between masculine and feminine look like? And so the last 20 years has been that journey for me, is trying to find that balance, trying to recover and discover those parts of me that are feminine that balance out the masculine so that I could actually love and parent my daughter well.
That's so beautiful, Forrest. And I must say, your daughter is a very lucky woman.
Thank you. All right, Victoria, I'll to you.
Well, no, I thank you for listening to your heart, knowing that that was something important to address. I think there's a lot of single women who raise their kids alone and have to step into their own masculine And even that isn't something that's talked about a lot, and how to hold on to the feminine while also holding the masculine in that role. But I'd love to hear you talk a little more about what collaboration and that co-creation feels like. And I know you do that all the time through Bioneers, and you've observed it in hundreds of different ways. And what do you see happening? Do you feel like more people are understanding and stepping into authentic collaboration and co-creation that honors both the masculine and the feminine, that honors all the different intersectional issues which are interconnected? Or do you feel like it's following kind of the binary that the rest of the culture is exaggerating? Collaboration is a difficult thing, especially in the nonprofit world, because the system is set up that we're in competition around fundraising, and there's a scarcity sort of mindset. But beyond that, what advice might you share with the whole movement about new ways of collaboration and co-creation?
Well, I do see some really hopeful trends emergent, even within the nonprofit sector. There is more and more collaboration and coalition building. And as some of what we're witnessing is that there is a generational transfer of wealth. And as a result of that, there are philanthropists who are really focusing on funding collaborative efforts and larger scale collaborations. But, what occurs to me, Victoria, in listening to you, really kind of relates to what I've heard each of you mention, is the connection between the individual and the systemic changes. And what I realize is that my dream is that if everyone becomes more invested in being relationally intelligent instead of analytically and strategically intelligent, in leading more from their hearts than from their minds, then the likelihood of effective collaborations emerging from those relationships increases dramatically. And I think what's related to that is something that I really learned from all of those deep immersive leadership trainings, which was, if we place relationship ahead of task, part of what our culture, with all of its patriarchal inclinations, has taught us is to be very task-oriented. And when you're coming online with a new relationship, it doesn't work to jump immediately into strategy. What we've found in working to develop a healthy culture within our organization is you have to create space and time for a whole human orientation to emerge. And I think that that's true whether in the for-profit world or the nonprofit world or the service industry. It's really about deep listening and caring and discovering who each person in the room is and what they're grappling with right now in order to give them space to bring their best work and to show you their best selves. And so in many ways, I think cultivating relational intelligence is probably one of the most important things we could do, both within ourselves and with each other, and in relation to our larger systems and policies.
I'm intrigued by some resonance in what you're talking about and in the ways that I teach community development. I teach for a master's program, and our program actually focuses on the practices of deep listening, to pick up a phrase that you use in the book as well. But deep listening to a particular end, deep listening so that we can know who we are with, so that we can recognize what people are bringing to the table. And my students tend to end up all over the world in contexts of service, whether it's relief or development, poverty work, social justice work. But I think one of the things they run into is those elements of that culture, the culture of community development, that relies a lot on and values a lot expertise. So if you're coming into a situation, even if it's not your culture, you generally are thinking that you know the right answers, that you've got tried and true solutions. But also many of those solutions tend not to be sustainable because the people don't own them. They didn't come from the people that they're trying to help and serve. So we developed a word, copowerment, as a counter to empowerment. Empowerment's an awesome word sometimes, but it's a top-down word. It suggests that one party has the power that they give to the other. It doesn't really make room for them giving back. So we invented the word copowerment as a more accurate term to the dynamic that we're trying to cultivate, that when you go into a situation and you want to help, you need everyone present. The people who you're ostensibly trying to help are making you possible as well, making the solutions possible. And so unless that listening happens, copowerment can't happen. So I found much in the book was really an affirmation of those ideas, which I'm sad to say are not that prevalent in the world of relief and development. But I love the fact that you are promoting those ideas in ways that I think are freeing people to understand what it means to surrender themselves to the strengths of others.
That's beautiful, Forrest. I'm so glad you're teaching in that way. And for me, it really describes that any good relationship is about reciprocity. And I love that in relationships between elders and youngers, a friend taught me a long time ago, that's mutual mentorship. And the other thing that your description brought to mind for me is the first book that I did called Moonrise, The Power of Women Leading from the Heart. And it's 30 essays that I culled from all my years of Bioneers. And what I was looking for was patterns about how women and some men are reinventing leadership. And what I saw was that one of the most prevalent patterns was that instead of leadership having to do with an externally conferred authority, like a graduate degree or an inherited wealth or a badge, instead, the leaders that I most admired were really empowered or co-powered by the passion of their hearts and their commitments to what they love and found most sacred. And so that's another way that I think we're reinventing leadership all the time. And you're certainly doing that in your teaching. That's beautiful.
I want to jump in too, because what you're both talking about is the work that I'm doing within Seminary of the Wild and the Wild Church Network is adding the element of that same kind of reciprocity and reverential conversation with the land herself. And so, that we make these plans and we plan these campaigns, or a church has property and they're going to rewild it or something sounds good, but we've forgotten the capacity to enter into actual conversation with the trees and the soil and the mountains and the rain, and to ask permission and to express gratitude. And as others are talking about this too, that this is just part of what it means to be human. And so we're reconnecting with part of who we are, and that inner authority has that capacity to listen to a tree. And the answers that we are looking for, we don't know them. We don't know those answers. So that same arrogance we do in thinking that we're going to rewild the land or take out invasive species without really listening. And so that's what the whole spiritual movement is too, is how to listen to the land and listen to our place as sacred relationship of reciprocity that our indigenous brothers and sisters never forgot. And yet those of us who have been disconnected many generations ago just need the encouragement to remember and to playfully even re-engage in that spiritual practice.
Absolutely. I have some friends who are just coming out with a book next year that's all about what happens physiologically when we experience awe and wonder. And there are amazing physiological correlations and emotional, psycho-emotional, spiritual correlations about how it heals depression and opens us up. And it's as if our cultures have encouraged us to put away the small child within. And we need to bring that small child back out.
And that mycelial conversation you talked about in the beginning, like it's not just metaphorical. This is actual, real,
Yes.
God is reality.
Yes, and rituals create relationship.
Exactly. It's all about relationship.
Yeah.
In all of these realms that we're talking about, that relational capacity that the feminine embodies more, and then the masculine is ineffective without.
Yes. And the masculine needs for human wholeness, just as the feminine needs the masculine for human wholeness.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And boy, do we need all our wholeness for the time ahead.
That's for sure. Yes. Yeah. The times are urgent.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to maybe bring us to a close here by asking a question that's maybe more personal. And anyone who has invested their lives in caring for the earth knows that it can be difficult and daunting work. I'm wondering, for you, what is the hardest aspect of that work personally? And maybe correspondingly, what is it that sustains you and gives you hope to press on?
Well, some of the hardest things for me are witnessing the cancel culture and shooting across the circle that often happens in otherwise well-meaning and aligned communities. And the false separation that I mentioned earlier that tends to factionalize our movements. And as climate change has accelerated in recent years, I've had to really look at whether our work with Bioneers didn't succeed or whether we succeeded in different ways than we'd planned. But what gives me the most hope, really, is I have learned from having so many Indigenous mentors to really acknowledge how the past must be integrated in our visions for the future. And for me, part of what that means is recognizing what my ancestors have been through as Ashkenazi Jews who have been genocided and run out of almost every continent on earth over the last several thousand years, and how we have managed to persevere and to, in many cases, really retain some of the essential nuggets of culture that have to do with questioning and challenging and standing for justice. And similarly, how generations, so many generations of Indigenous people all over the world have managed to survive incredible, horrifying efforts at wiping out their personhood, their cultures, their lineages, and their lands. But the perseverance and the drive, and the same thing with people who are descendants of slaves, that there has been a kind of tenacity and a perseverance that I find tremendously hopeful. I have to believe that ultimately nature is too mysterious and powerful and sacred in us and in all of creation for her to allow us to wipe ourselves out.
We've been in conversation with Nina Simons, co-founder of Bioneers and author of the book called Nature, Culture, and the Sacred. For more information about the organization or the book, check out the show notes for this episode on the podcast webpage. And speaking of show notes, I want to express appreciation for the work of Rochelle Nordman, the person who creates those show notes week to week. And as she leaves the Earthkeepers production team, we say a heartfelt thank you and we bless her adventures to come. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Timothy Connor is our editor, and Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.